Hello, everybody. Welcome to the introduction to the Cosmic Messenger. My name is Sophia Mona Lisa of the Golden Ray Center and the Rose Rule Mystery School. And I've got with me today Maureen Paxton and Doreen Fisher, and I'm so excited for them to join me as I do this introduction. The introduction that we're doing today is actually based on this book. It's called the Hermetica Triptycha, and it's written by Gary P Caton, and it's all about the Mercury Synodic Cycle, which is an astrological piece. And you'll find out as we go through the introduction that that's just one of the pieces that's in this book. This is a phenomenal book. And so I'm just going to tell you right now, if you're at all interested in maybe even contemplating taking this class, you want to know more about Mercury, you've got to get this book. It's a fabulous book, and you can get it on Amazon. And I'm probably going to plug it again at the end, so just to let you know. So this is our agenda for today. First of all, we see over here on the right upper corner, we have an image of this statue of Mercury. He is on top of the clock at the Grand Central Station, outside the Grand Central Station in New York. And he's there with some other mythical figures as well, but he's right there at the top. And so we're going to talk about the faces of the cosmic messenger. We're going to talk about Hermeticism. We're going to go really deep into the Mercury Synodic Cycle. And I'll tell you, that piece in this book can be a bit challenging to break down and understand. I've been through it a half dozen times, and I feel like I've really gotten a shaky handle on it. So I'm going to do my best to take you through it. But what's interesting to know is that the Synodic Cycle, as we've discussed in our previous classes, in the Venus class and the Mars class, is very different. It's very different than the Venus cycle, and it's very different in the Mars cycle. And I'll point some of those things out as we're going along. So there are, rather than phases that the Mars and Venus synodic cycles have, there are key events, and there's 4 key events in Mercury Synodic Cycles. So we'll talk about those. Has to do with conjunctions and elongations. And these are all astrological terms, conjunction and elongation. You two probably know what a conjunction is. I'll go over that again, and then we'll learn about these elongations. And then the Mercury Elemental Year, which is what the synodic cycle is based on. It's based on an element and not an astrological sign like the Venus and Mars synodic cycles. So there are some pieces related to the Mercury elemental year that we're going to talk about. And then what I'm doing is I've actually gone ahead and I have looked at our charts, and I've pulled out those pieces related to Mercury from our chart that are related to these pieces. And so we'll go over those. And then what we're going to do is, if you're not aware, we are right now in Mercury Retrograde. It's the final Mercury Retrograde phase of 2021. So we're going to look at our current elemental year, and we're going to look at this Mercury Retrograde phase, and we're going to tie it back to these key events to see what's been going on. Then I'm going to talk about the Alchemy of Transformation and what the monthly investment for this course will be. And of course, always I include opportunity for questions and answers. So I'm really excited to dive right in. Whoops, sorry, getting ahead of myself. I'm so excited. To the faces of the cosmic messenger. So we have to go way back in time to when the Egyptians were on, the Egyptian culture was thriving. And during that time in the Egyptian pantheon, here's an image of Thoth. He was considered to be the inventor of writing, magic, and astrology. And so many people know that he is related to writing, But I don't think a lot of people know that he's related to magic and astrology. And we're going to see why that's significant on the next slide. So then the Greeks came along and they kind of adopted Thoth into their culture, and they named this cosmic messenger Hermes in the Greek pantheon. And here's an image of Hermes. And they referred to him as the divine revealer of sacred mysteries, also related to writing, magic, astrology. We're going to see the three, what they call sister arts, on the next slide. And then the Romans came along and adopted Hermes, and they call that god Mercury. So there's Mercury, Hermes, and Thoth, the gods from these pantheons that we refer to archetypically as the cosmic messenger. And then there's Mercury, the planet, who represents those archetypes in the sky, whose synodic cycle we're going to be looking at. So any questions so far?
No, thank you.
Okay, great. All right, so this is the really super groovy part, in my opinion. Hermeticism, which of course is a term that's based on the name of Hermes, the Greek god, is a religious and philosophical tradition. And it combines these, what they call three sister arts: astrology, which we're going to be talking about today with the Mercury Synodic Cycle; alchemy, which we're going to just barely dip our toes into at the end; and theurgy, which is magic. So because I'm wanting to try to keep this introductory class to about an hour, we just don't have the time and the scope to go into the alchemy and the magic. However, do not be dismayed, because in our class that's going to start in January, these two pieces are going to be an integral part of the class. And again, in this book, Hermetica Triptycha, there's a whole section, section 2, that's related to this part, the alchemy and the magic, that we're just not even going to scratch the surface of today. So a fascinating read. So here we go. All right, so here are some key things to understand about the Mercury Synodic Cycle. It passes through 3 repeated degrees over 40 days. Now, let me clarify that, and we're going to see an image later. When it's passing through these 3 repeated degrees, Gary Caton, I'm so sorry, let me turn my phone off. Gary Caton frequently says within the book that these 3 repeated degrees are exact degrees. And the truth of the matter is that was with my autism, and my being an Aspie, I take things very literally. So that was very confusing for me. And I had to spend a lot of time reading and rereading over that and looking at the ephemeris that he's put together in the back of this book. And it's not really 3 exact degrees. However, it's an orb of degrees. And that orb, depending on which Mercury Synodic Cycle you're in, could be an orb of 1 or 2 degrees on either side, or it could stretch up to 3 and maybe 5. So it's in a very close orb of degrees that Mercury passes through 3 times during the 40 days of the full synodic cycle. The next thing about the Mercury Synodic Cycle is it moves through 3 signs of one elemental, and this is Gary's word, triplicity. So that means, like this year, it's an elemental air year. So Mercury started out at the beginning of the year going through Aquarius. In the middle of the year, it went through Gemini, and right now with its retrograde cycle, it's in Libra. So those 3 signs are air elements, and that's why he calls them a triplicity. And so the Mercury Synodic Cycle is based on an elemental return. When will Mercury come back to the air sign? That will be a next return, which is very different, like I said, from the Venus and Mars synodic cycles, which are based on an astrological sign. Right now, Venus is in Gemini, doing her Gemini goddess journey, and Mars, he's going through the Aries synodic cycle, so very different. Now, it cycles through all four elements. And if you're not familiar with astrology, the elements are air, fire, earth, and water. So it cycles through all four of those elements every 6 to 7 years. And so what happens is during a 79-year period, which is considered a typical lifespan, each person will have 12 elemental returns. And what's really exciting that Gary discovered is in that 79th year, Mercury does return to the exact degree of its location at your postnatal conjunction. Now, I know postnatal conjunction means nothing to you right now. We're going to go into it. But what it does is it brings about a full circle moment. So typically, these 40-day cycles that happen 3 times a year are called the short-term cycle. And then each of the triplicities that happen is called the long-term cycle. And traditionally, that's what astrologers looked at. But when Gary discovered this cycle, this 79-year cycle, this much larger cycle, it changed everything, because Mercury, Venus, Mars, these are fast-moving planets that are close to the sun, and they've always been identified as personal planets. The outlying planets, Saturn, Jupiter, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, slow-moving planets, these have been known as transpersonal planets, and actually Saturn is in that liminal space between the inner planets and the outer planets as the bridge, as the cosmic gatekeeper. So when he discovered this, all of a sudden it changed the possibility that what has been known as a personal planet is also transformational, just like the outer transpersonal planets. And we're going to see some of that as we go into the later slides. So do either of you have any questions about this part of the synodic cycle?
So yes. So when it says 12 elemental returns over 79 years, so that's each individual?
That's each individual. Absolutely. And when we get to a later slide, I'm going to show you what number of elemental return you've just completed and when your next elemental return is going to begin. And what's really fascinating, because of the alchemical piece, and I'm just going to kind of do a spoiler alert here. What's really fascinating is these elemental returns are really significant in terms of the alchemical transformation, because he takes the 3 stages of alchemy and he's aligned them with what Maureen and I, and if you've been following the Mars classes, Doreen, you'll be familiar too, with the hero's journey. And remember, Joseph Campbell had the three acts of the hero's journey: the departure, which Gary Caton calls the separation, the initiation, and then the return. And so what he does, and he aligns those 3 parts of the hero's journey that Joseph Campbell created to 3 phases of alchemy. And I should have written those names down, but I didn't because I wasn't really intending to go into this very much. But what happens is he takes these 12 elemental returns and he breaks them down into 3 pieces. So the first 4 elemental returns relate to the first part of the alchemy. The second 4 relate to the second part of the alchemy, and the final 4 relate to the third part of alchemy. So it is so rich and fascinating. And, you know, with my Scorpio goddess overtone, Scorpio goddesses are naturally have this innate ability, this natural inclination for magic and alchemy. And so this is just really fueling me in a whole new way. So here we have the picture of the sun with Mercury, because 2 of the major events have to do with conjunctions. And that's, of course, when Mercury and the sun are coming together in the sky. So, and Gary says here, by attuning ourselves to the cosmic rhythms of the spirit of Hermes and ritually arranging the elements of our lives in concert, I believe we can and so for somebody like you, Doreen, who has a Gemini ascendant, and so Mercury is the ruler of Gemini, is ruling your chart, this is going to be just like opening you up to incredible magic, is all I can say. It's going to be phenomenal. Okay, so let's talk about the 4 key elements. So, there are 2 kinds of conjunctions, and there are 2 kinds of elongations. And so the first conjunction is what's called a superior conjunction. That means Mercury has proceeded out ahead of the sun. Oh no, that's not what it means. See, can be very confusing. The superior conjunction is when Mercury and the sun come together, and then Mercury proceeds out ahead of the sun in the zodiac, which we're going to look at that, because clarifying that it's in the zodiac is a big piece. And don't get tripped up on this if you're not understanding it now. It's going to take several times of going through this to understand it. I'm still, you know, tiptoeing my way through it. And then what happens is Mercury goes out ahead of the sun until it goes out to what's called its evening elongation. It can only go out so far. And usually it'll go out about 17 to 28 degrees ahead of the sun, but it won't go any further. So, and when it reaches that evening elongation, which happens as the second event, when it's reached that outer limit, so to speak, that happens above the horizon in the western evening sky. You can actually see that event in the sky right about dusk. And then what happens is Mercury begins to slow down, and the sun catches up with Mercury. And then Mercury appears to stop altogether, and that's what we call stationing for its retrograde. And then it goes reverse and joins the sun at the inferior conjunction. So the inferior conjunction is when the sun and Mercury are coming together in the sky at the same place below the horizon. It happens during the Mercury retrograde period. And actually, what's really significant about that inferior conjunction is it happens at the midpoint of the retrograde period, about 10 or 11 days after Mercury stations retrograde and about 10 or 11 days before stationing direct. So that whole retrograde period is approximately 3 weeks. So that middle week And specifically the 2 or 3 days around that inferior conjunction when the sun and Mercury are together is really, this is the time when the magic happens. Just like how we do ceremony, you know, at new moons and full moons, we know that that's a magical time. We do ceremonies at equinoxes, it's a magical time. This particular time in the Mercury Synodic Cycle is the magical time, right there around the inferior conjunction. And so then what happens is Mercury starts to resume its direct motion. It's still going slow, and the sun stretches out the distance between them. Again, no more than 17 to 28 degrees until Mercury reaches the morning elongation. And this morning elongation is when Mercury has risen from the underworld above the horizon in the eastern morning sky. And then after the morning elongation, Mercury begins to speed up again until it gradually catches up with the sun and passes it to go into that first event again, the superior conjunction. So those are the 4 big events. And again, Gary Caton says, and I put this near, that these 3 events that I've highlighted, the evening elongation, the inferior conjunction, and the morning elongation, happen within that very close orb of degrees in the zodiac. And what we're going to see is that the point that the superior conjunction makes and the points that the inferior conjunction makes creates, this is the dance, it creates the Star of David. We know with the Venus Synodic Cycle that over the 8 years, the Venus creates the rose in the sky. Mercury is creating this, what we call the Star of David, or we could even call the star tetrahedron. And so what happens is here you've got the downward facing triangle that represents the inferior conjunction and the upward facing triangle that represents the superior conjunction. So how do you know if it's a superior conjunction or an inferior conjunction? Well, the big thing for me is the inferior conjunction happens when Mercury is retrograde. If Mercury's not retrograde, then it's the superior conjunction. The other 2 ways that you can tell is with the superior conjunction, Mercury is in a direct motion through the zodiac, and Mercury and the sun are traveling in the same direction. And we're going to see that on what that looks like on the next slide. With the inferior conjunction, Mercury is in retrograde motion through the zodiac, and Mercury and the sun are traveling in opposite directions. Now, I already gave you the information that this year is an air elemental year. So these first 2 inferior conjunctions that happened of the first 2 synodic cycles happened in Gemini, and they happened in Aquarius. And now we're in Libra for this 3rd of the triplicity cycle, and it's going to happen in Libra. And it's actually going to happen on Friday. This is super cool that we're having our class before this inferior conjunction, because that's the magical time when the sun and Mercury are standing together in this underworld. And Friday is the 8th. So October 8th, Friday, is when that inferior conjunction is going to happen. So already we're starting to see magic with Mercury's dance with the sun. Any question about this piece that I've shared so far?
So once we hit the 8th, that's when the retrograde is starting, or we are in retrograde and the 8th is when it's going to transition?
Very good question. So we're already in Mercury retrograde. Went stationed retrograde. I think it was August 23rd. So we're already in that Mercury retrograde phase. Mercury is in the underworld, but now it's coming up to be in the sky with the sun. That's the inferior conjunction. And remember, it's a couple of days either side of Friday. So, you know, even like as early as Wednesday, if you're consciously engaging with that inferior conjunction that's going to happen on Friday and through the weekend, that's the magical time. Okay. And Gary Caton says that the triangle has always been a universal symbol of stability and harmony. Together, these interlocking triangles of Mercury suggest unity, wholeness, and integration between opposites. So even in the synodics, the dance, the image that it's making in the sky with its dance with the sun, it's already embedded into the dance that this is a very alchemical, transformative cycle, because it's bringing together this unity, wholeness, and integration between the opposites. And we know from the mystery schools that they say as above, so below. And that's demonstrated here with the as above of the superior conjunction points and the so below with the inferior conjunction points. It's just beautiful, in my opinion. What do you think about all this, Maureen?
Yeah, it's incredible. All right. I'm real surprised, you know, that it creates the Star of David in the sky. I mean, that's very unbelievable. I mean, I don't know why, because I know Venus creates a symbol, and why not, I guess. But it's really, I just never thought about Mercury that way.
Right, right. Well, and that's part of what Gary Caton has kind of dedicated his work to is, you know, back in during the Greek culture and through Hermeticism, people worked consciously with the cosmic messenger, with the planet Mercury.
Yeah.
And we've lost that. And so he's wanting to bring that back to us. And of course, it makes absolute sense that, especially for Maureen and I, we've been working with Venus and with now Mars, the sacred feminine, the sacred masculine, for over a year now. Of course, Mercury wants to show up and say, hey, I've got something significant to add to the magic for you two Scorpio goddesses. Okay,
Sure.
So here we go. Now, again, a lot of astrological terms, but I'm going to do my best to clarify all of this. So here we have the basic astrological chart, the zodiacal chart, right? Starts with Aries, moves all the way around and comes back to Pisces. That's the basic chart. Now, this line here, which we always work with as our ascendant and our descendant, actually represents the horizon and the sky. So here, this is the east, so it's backwards from what we're normally considering. This is the east, where everything rises, and this is the west, where everything sets. So there's two ways of looking at this. There's what's called the zodiacal motion, meaning how Earth makes its annual revolution or annual rotation around the sun. The zodiacal motion goes from Aries all the way around to Pisces. So it's moving in this counterclockwise position. But you can also look at this chart in what's called the diurnal motion, meaning how the Earth's daily rotation around the sun looks. And so this is the day, this is why this is rising, this is setting, and it's looking like it's moving this way, like it's going clockwise, not counterclockwise. So depending on how you're looking at it, clockwise or counterclockwise, determines if you're looking at the Earth's rotation around the sun in terms of its yearly rotation or its daily rotation. Does that piece make sense?
Mhm.
Okay.
It does.
Good. Now, let's talk about these elongations. So we know that the morning elongation happens when Mercury rises and sets before the sun. So what happens is Mercury is behind the sun in the zodiac, going this way, and it's in front. I think I've got these backwards. See, this is the part that's tricky. I do. I've got them backwards. Let me just take a quick pause here, and I'm going to fix this slide. Just a second here. Okay, so here we go. So Mercury is behind the sun in the zodiac. In the zodiac is the key word, because we know, looking at my image here, that Sagittarius is behind Capricorn, Capricorn's behind Aquarius. So Mercury is behind the sun in the zodiac, but it precedes the sun in the sky. So remember, this is the horizon. The sun is rising and setting. So here with the morning elongation, Mercury is going ahead of the sun. It's going to set before the sun. Okay? Does that part make sense? All right.
I thought Mercury always, was visible on the horizon sometimes after the sun set. It's the only time I can see Mercury. I don't see Mercury often.
Right. That's at the evening elongation or at the morning elongation. The morning elongation, when Mercury rises before the sun, or at the evening elongation, when it sets before the sun. So at the evening elongation, I know it's confusing. Again, we don't have to be masters of this. We just kind of have to have a filmy understanding of it, because we're going to master this through the class. But it's important because these two events, the morning elongation and the evening elongation, are part of the synodic cycle. So in the evening elongation, Mercury is ahead of the sun in the zodiac. Okay, so here, Cancer is ahead of Gemini. Mercury is ahead of the sun in the zodiac, but it's following the sun. Okay?
Mhm.
And it rises and sets after the sun. So for the morning elongation, Mercury is rising before the sun. For the evening elongation, Mercury is setting after the sun. This is why you can see Mercury in the sky at these elongation points, because it's at its furthest away point. That's what the elongation is. Think of like a rubber band that you're stretching. How far can you stretch it before the rubber band breaks? And it's not going to let it go that far. It's going to bring it back again. Okay. So it's, yes, ma'am. Go ahead, Doreen.
So in relation to Earth's daily rotation and the annual rotation, right? That's where I'm confused now.
Okay, thank you for that question. Because we can see here in the chart that when we're looking at the Earth's daily rotation, we're moving clockwise, right? But when we're looking in terms of whether Mercury is ahead of the sun or behind the sun, but when we're looking at whether or not Mercury is preceding, whether Mercury is behind the sun in the zodiac or ahead of the sun in the zodiac, we're looking at the annual rotation because it goes like this. So we know, starting with Aries to Taurus to Gemini, Aries is behind Taurus, Taurus is behind Gemini, Gemini is behind Cancer. So it is blending both, looking at the daily rotation clockwise in terms of whether Mercury is ahead of the sun or behind the sun, but also the zodiacal counterclockwise in terms of whether Mercury is in a sign ahead of the sun or a sign behind the sun, right?
So that was going to be my next question. So it's not necessarily synonymous that Earth's daily rotation is always an evening elongation. So is that correct or not correct? So Earth's daily rotation, is it always an evening elongation?
Well, I think that what you want to focus on is that the daily rotation gives you the points for on the horizon for where the planet is rising and where the planet is setting. Does that make sense? So that in the evening elongation, which is over here in the western sky, first, I mean, I know it's confusing. It makes you think you want to put these backwards. But first the sun sets and then Mercury sets, which is why you can see. Again, don't allow your brain to get like caught up in all of this part. I just really want you to understand at this point the morning elongation and the evening elongation, because there's significant points, events in the synodic cycle. We'll master this later, okay? Like I said, I had a really tough time myself even pulling this picture together for you, okay? So just know that the morning elongation happens in the eastern morning sky and the evening elongation happens in the western evening sky. Just hang on to that piece, okay? Good, good, okay. So moving on then. We've got the 4 points. We know what the pattern of the points are. Superior conjunction, evening elongation, inferior conjunction, and morning elongation. Those are the 4 events, okay? We know what the superior conjunction is and the inferior conjunction is. You don't have to master that. Just know that the inferior conjunction happens during the retrograde cycle. So it's below the horizon, right? Below the horizon. That's where Mercury is during the retrograde. And then the morning elongation happens in the east in the morning and then the evening one happens in the west. Okay. All right. So then there's a whole new piece related to this elemental year that's not at all a part of the Venus and Mars synodic cycles. So to determine, first of all, your elemental year, you have to look up in this book, which I've already done for both of you, and find out during your birth year which element was Mercury retrograde in. Okay, and I'm going to show you that on the next slides. That's how you know what your elemental year is. For me, when I was born, Mercury was retrograding through the air signs. This year, Mercury's retrograding through an air sign. I'm having an elemental return, a Mercury return. Okay, so that's only one piece of it. Now, what's really important to understand about this Mercury retrograde is we've always talked about with retrograde planets that you have to use the RE. I've always said anytime any planet is retrograde, it's a vision quest. And you use the RE words: reimagine, revise, renew, recover, right? So with Mercury, because remember, Mercury's all about communication, thoughts, writing, speaking, anything to do with perception and communicating. During a Mercury retrograde, what you're called to do is reimagine, revise, and renew whatever the consensus reality concerning the element of that sign is. And also the universal or collective human themes, needs, and questions that the element symbolizes. So this is taken from his book, and I know he talks about the element of the sign in this. And a lot of people, unlike Maureen and I, who have done work with the elements, aren't really going to understand what the elements are all about. We'll get more into what the elements are all about in the class, because all the work that we've done so far has been related to the actual sign. What does the sign of Aquarius have to do with it? It has to do with freedom. What does the sign of Libra have to do with it? It has to do with balance, that kind of thing. So it's, again, it's a kind of a different emphasis that way. However, what we discover here is that, remember, there's 3 signs that Mercury is retrograding in during your birth year. When you are born, Mercury has had an inferior conjunction, right? The conjunction between the sun and Mercury in the underworld during that retrograde period before you were born, which is called prenatal, a prenatal inferior conjunction. And then after you're born, Mercury will go through a retrograde cycle and have an inferior conjunction, Mercury and Sun coming together. That's called a post-natal. In your chart, the chart that's cast at your time of birth, the sign and house where the prenatal inferior conjunction happened and the sign and house of where the postnatal conjunction happened are significant for you individually, and we'll look at that now. Okay, so for the sign and house where Mercury and Sun came together in the underworld during the retrograde period before you were born, the sign shows you in terms of, thought forms of the status quo, where you as an individual are going to be breaking apart those thought forms because they've become old and stagnant. And the house that occurs in is how and where you're going to feel restless and instinctively drawn toward unconventional expressions that run counter to established traditions. This is why, they associate these teenage years with this kind of rebellion, because by the time you're a teenager, 14 years old, you're having your second Mercury return, right? And you're trying to get away from the established traditions and break apart the old thought forms. So what happens is that person has come in to show humanity and the collective answers that we have come to accept for basic themes and needs and questions are no longer applicable. What you've done before doesn't work. And so what it does is it serves to break up the established order, which in turn allows space for something new to emerge. And what I'm seeing in my head is, think of Elvis Presley. He grew up poor. They were so poor that they had to live in the projects area, which was on what they called at that time, the other side of the tracks, right? And so he was very much influenced in his music by the Black American culture of music, because that's where he grew up. He hung out with those Black musicians. He learned their style of music. And then when he got onto the world stage, or let's just say the national stage, right? There was a lot of controversy because they didn't want a musician playing Black music. They didn't want a white musician playing Black music. That was like a huge controversy. And so you can see how Elvis played this role of even breaking down this. He was like the precursor of the civil rights movement in terms of breaking down barriers between Black culture and white culture. So I haven't looked at his chart. I should do that. But that's something that would have been related to where Mercury had its conjunction with the sun in retrograde, the inferior conjunction, before he was born. Now, after you're born, the sign and the house also have a significant impact on you in terms of, what drives you, what your interests are, where you're going. And so the sign is helping you to find and bring new contents welling up from the collective unconsciousness into your own personal expression. Well, see, this idea of breaking down barriers between the Black culture and the white culture was already coming up from the collective unconscious. Elvis just brought it into his personal expression before anybody else was, right? In a very public way, let's say. And what happens is you bring it into your personal expression to replace the remnants of, right, what doesn't work anymore, which isn't applicable anymore, the fading status quo. And the house causes the individual to feel instinctively called toward communicating or expressing in an avant-garde fashion, seeking out new and cutting-edge expressions that are arising from the collective unconscious. And so what that post-natal inferior conjunction is doing is it's serving to bring together and establish a new order, which keeps the societies alive and growing and capable of responding to change. So you see, this is a whole new influence, planetary influence, than what we have experienced before or looked at before with the Venus and Mars synodic cycles. Does this piece make sense to you?
And are these counted as the first two of your 12?
No.
Oh.
No, because remember, it's happening within that elemental year. So wherever you were born, the one before it, the one after it. So until Mercury comes back to that place at the age of 6 or 7, you're not having your first return until the age of 6 or 7. Okay, did that answer that question? But you can see based on when you were born and where these signs and houses are, it's tremendously influencing what drives you, so to speak. Okay. All right. So we're going to look at that for each of us as well. But before we do, there's one other unique piece to this Mercury elemental year that has to be looked at in terms of how Mercury is influencing you. And the word that Gary Caton uses is called a trigon, a trigon. And he says that there are 4 different trigons of houses that can be activated within a chart. So remember, the elemental year, Mercury is retrograding in 3 signs of the same element. And somewhere in your chart, those 3 signs are located in a particular house in your chart. Okay. So if your elemental signs fall in the 1st, 5th, and 9th houses, that's a trigon, right? 3 houses. He has identified, he is calling that 1st, 5th, and 9th house the identity trigon. And the reason he's calling it the identity trigon is because he is telling us that the angular houses of the chart define the primary purpose of the entire trigon. So let's go back and look at the basic chart. The angles. This is an angle. Let me move this. This is an angle. This is an angle. And that's an angle. So we normally call that the 1st house, right, where the ascendant is, the 1st house, the 4th house where the IC is, the 7th house where the descendant is, and the 10th house where the midheaven is. Those are the angular houses. If one of your, or if one of your signs falls into one of those 4 angles, and one of them will, right? It's a matter of which one will. That house, that angle defines the purpose of your 3 elements, your 3 signs of your element, okay? And so what he's done is he's named them based on the angular house. So we know the 1st house has to do with the self. So that's why he's called it the identity trigon. The next one, which would include the 2nd, 6th, and 10th houses, we know that the 10th house, right, where that midheaven is the angle. And so he's named it the trigon of mastery, because remember, the 10th house is the work that you're known for in the world, not your job, but the work that you're known for. The next trigon is the 3rd, 7th, and 11th houses. The angular house there is the 7th, right? That's where the descendant is. And the 7th house rules your relationship. So he's called it the relationship trigon. And the last trigon is the 4th, 8th, and 12th houses. The 4th house is where that angular house is, right? Where the IC is, your energetic taproot. 4th house rules your family of origin, your home. And so he calls that the trigon of dynasty. So each of us have a specific trigon. And in this book, which we're not going to do today because it's way beyond the scope of this, he defines what each of these trigons is all about in terms of like kind of a mission of what Mercury is doing through you. Okay, so we'll learn more about that. All right, then he says this. So the angular houses define the primary purpose of your trigon. The succedent houses, again, this is an astrological word, And so what are the succeeded houses? The 2nd, the 5th, the 8th, and the 11th houses. The succeeding houses serve to stabilize the trigon's purpose by solidifying and holding the fruits of those activities. And then the cadent house, again, an astrological term, cadent house. What are the cadent houses? The 3rd, 6th, 9th, and 12th houses. They serve to distribute the fruits of the trigon, which in turn naturally catalyzes further action back into the angular house. And so you can see that every trigon has an angular house, a succeedent house, and a cadent house. So we're all getting that same effect, no matter which one of the 4 trigons we have. And you see that this is a natural cycle of perpetual energy exchange that drives Mercury through the elemental year. Okay? So notice here what Gary says. These 3 signs act as a system so that even small changes in any one of these areas will eventually have ripple effects throughout all 3. And because all 3 areas are so deeply interconnected, we must maintain awareness of all 3 houses in any individual example. That's important because we have a tendency over the course of the year to say, oh my God, it's Mercury retrograde again. And we don't think about this Mercury retrograde being a part of a larger cycle of the 3 Mercury retrogrades in a year. And so what's happening over here in Aquarius is going to affect what's happening over here in Gemini, which is going to affect what's happening over here in Libra, where we are right now. Okay? Any questions on this concept of the trigon? Okay, let's look at this information related to each of us in terms of delineating our personal charts. So I just went from the eldest to the youngest, just to let you know. So we're starting with Maureen. Okay, so what we know now about Maureen is that during her year of birth, Mercury was retrograding in the water signs. So anytime Mercury comes back to the water element is when she will have a Mercury return. And, you know, I guess I should have put up here and parenthetically for those that don't know like we do, the water signs are Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces. Okay. So Maureen, you have just completed your 10th return, your 10th Mercury return. That was completed February 7th of this year. Remember in January when I said you're having a Mercury return, I'm having a Mercury return at our birthdays? Do you remember that? And I said, and we should do charts about our Mercury returns. Do you remember that?
No.
Yeah. Yeah. See, even back in January, I was already tapping into this. So
Yeah.
your Mercury return was completing February 7th. Mine was just getting ready to start. Okay. That's why in January, I was already tuned into this. Remember, Maureen and I have our birthdays one day after each other. I'm on the 8th, she's on the 9th. All right. So this information in terms of where's my prenatal inferior conjunction and where's my postnatal inferior conjunction, he's got it all in this book, and you can find it in the ephemeris, but I've done the work for you guys, okay?
Thank you.
So Maureen, your prenatal inferior conjunction happened in Scorpio.
Oh.
No surprise. This is why you are even more so aligned with these Scorpio energies. You've got it on your ascendant. You've got, you know, the Scorpio goddess overtone, you know, and now you see that with Mercury being in this water element, it's in your prenatal inferior conjunction. So what does that mean? Everything related to the Scorpio energy themes and the first house energy themes, you are here to break up the established order. So one of the first things that pops into my mind is, what is Scorpio about? It's about power. What is the first house about? The self. How the self uses their power. And so immediately we can jump to patriarchy, how the patriarchy uses power over others, right? To push their will. And so here you are, as just one example, here to break up this established patriarchal order so that something new can come in, where people are not using their power over others or having to subject their power, be submissive to others. You're here to where we're going to be able to use our power consciously and equally to create, but not to be powerful over or to submit to. And with your generation, that is a huge undertaking, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Because we can see, that didn't really start to show up on the world stage until maybe about the 60s, when the hippie age came in and they were, free love and all of this stuff. Because still in the 50s, you had these very gender roles. The husband went out, brought home the bacon. The woman stayed home. She took care of the house, right? Mm-hmm. So can you see how you've been influenced by this prenatal inferior conjunction related to power and the self, and breaking up those roles, breaking up the roles for what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a mother, what it means to be a father, what it means to be a daughter, what it means to be a son, right? What it means to be an employer, what it means to be an employee, what it means to be a teacher, what it means to be a student, breaking up those power structures that are built into hierarchy, right? And then your postnatal inferior conjunction occurred in Pisces, the fifth house. Fifth house is all about creation. What are you creating? From unity consciousness, right? That's allowing that conscious equal partnership to be able to come in. I see you as a master and recognize you as a master. You see me as a master and recognize me as a master. And so this is where you're driven to bring together and establish a new order that keeps our societies alive and growing, capable of responding to change. And where are you seeing that most recently after having just completed that 10th return? You're seeing it in the matrices that you've been creating for the collective.
That's true. Right. Wow. Yeah. Okay. How about that?
How about that? Isn't it interesting that as that 10th return completed, all of a sudden you started birthing these new matrices? Mm-hmm. And just for the audience, can you remind them of has it been 2 or 3 now that you've done?
3.
3. Can you remind us of the 3 matrices and the themes they're related to?
Yeah. The first one was related to protecting the child from pedophile, the cultural significance of pedophilia in society throughout history. I addressed that. The second one was about animal welfare. And the third one was about gather the tribes. It's the women who come together, who are developing the new world order. It's the women who are addressing this to bring a more balanced ideology back, and emphasis on family and taking care of the planet and those kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you can see how
Wow.
each of those themes is about breaking up the established order that no longer is applicable and bringing in new ideas, new concepts that we as a collective consciousness can carry forward.
Right. Exactly right.
Yeah. So you'll learn more about the identity trigon in the class specific to you, but that's the trigon that you're working with, okay? All right. Any questions, Maureen, about anything that I've shared there?
No, not right now.
Okay. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on mine, except that I do want to point out something. I am currently in my 9th elemental return. And what is unique about the 9th elemental return is that it coincides with the 2nd Saturn return, which I've been having all year long. I've already had 2 activations of my 2nd Saturn return. My final activation will happen on December 21st, and also coincides with your 5th Jupiter return. And my 5th Jupiter return will happen next year on February 14th. And Gary Caton calls this specifically this 9th return because it coincides with these 2 major planetary returns, a most significant rite of passage into elderhood. So again, not surprising that the whole drive to bring this material out is a part of this 9th return for me. Okay. I am born in the air element, and you'll see here that my postnatal inferior conjunction is in Aquarius in the 8th house. What did I say about Aquarius? Freedom, right? Freedom, all the ways you can liberate yourselves. What is 8th house? Well, 8th house is ruled by Scorpio. So your own personal power, right? How you can stand in your sovereignty. And so we discussed in the last class, Maureen, how the last Mars class, how with both of us having a Scorpio goddess overtone, how your work with the Scorpio energies is very different than my work with the Scorpio energies. So my work with those energies is really about helping people stand in their own sovereignty to liberate themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And no surprise that my Trigon is the Trigon of dynasty, which has to do with the family lineage. And remember, was it a year or more ago, Maureen, when we were taking a class and they were starting to dive into breaking up ancestral energies. And I said, I've already done that work in my family. Yeah. No surprise. I've got this Trigon of dynasty. I've done a lot of work with the ancestral lineages and healing the wounds of the ancestral lineage. So let's look at Doreen. Now, let me just say before we get to Doreen that she is very unique.
I believe that. Yeah.
And that's because only 20% of the people are born when Mercury is in an elemental year that's moving from one element to another. And Doreen, you're a part of that 20%. And so when you were born with the Earth elemental return, and that's where your pre-natal inferior conjunction was. It was in the Earth element of Virgo. But you were right there where it was transitioning from Earth to fire. So your postnatal inferior conjunction is in Sagittarius. Very unique. Only 20% of the people. This is what makes it even more unique. When Mercury was having its Inferior retrograde before you were born, it was conjunct the planet Venus. And then when it was having its inferior conjunction after you were born, it was conjunct the planet of Jupiter. I mean, that's just phenomenal. Just phenomenal. And so what happens is you come to a place in your life where you realize that as an individual, you have shifted from the earth element into the fire element. And only you can know that. And I will just say that right now, Doreen is having her Chiron return, which is a huge initiation point. And if you haven't yet recognized when we go through the class that you've already shifted from earth to fire, I suspect, Gary doesn't talk about this in the book. However, intuitively, I suspect that this Chiron return could be that shift from the earth element to the fire element for you. Okay. So he says here that this transition between elements suggests that these individuals are here to make important transitions, both in their personal growth and karma, as well as in the Dharma or collective contribution. This means, this can mean there will be a significant and important transition in the life of the individual, such as that they live two very different lives within one lifetime, or it may mean that they can learn to live their whole, that should say, life with one foot each in two very different worlds. So again, only you will know which of those are applicable to you. You're also a part of the identity trigon in the earth element, as is Maureen. But with the fire element, you shift into the Trigon of mastery. So feeling into, do you have this book yet, Doreen?
I don't.
Because I know I've referred you to this book before, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need to buy this book today. So that you can read about these trigons and feel into where you are. Do you have one foot in each? Are you moving away from one into the other?
Mm-hmm.
You know, start feeling into that.
Mm-hmm.
So is there anything about your information? Oh, forgot to tell you, you have completed your seventh natal return, your seventh Mercury return. You completed that December 11th, 2017.
Oh.
So the next Earth return starts January 7th, 2023. The next fire return is April 11th, 2024. Just so that you know when those returns will be, when you figure out which element you're aligning with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so coming up.
Yes. Yes. I can see that. I feel like I'm shifting right now a lot in regards to my own personal growth.
Yeah.
It's where I feel like I'm at right now.
Yeah.
And I feel like what I can learn from that, right, to share with others is kind of where I'm at right now.
Right, right. And let's look a little closer at your postnatal inferior conjunction. You know, first of all, Jupiter is the ruler of Sagittarius, and we know that Jupiter amplifies, expands anything it touches. So Sagittarius is about the quest for truth. And in the sixth house, this is your day-to-day life. How is everything about your day-to-day life, your day-to-day routine aligned with your personal quest for truth, the meaning of life?
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Isn't it? I guess, like, for me, it's like I have this here. This is actually like a quote from MLK, Martin Luther King. So he said, use me, God, show me how to take what I am, who I want to be, and what I can do, and use it for a purpose greater than myself. That's something that just kind of resonates with me on multiple levels.
Sure, because that purpose greater than yourself has to do with these higher truths that Sagittarius is constantly seeking and aiming for. And so that's taking you into higher spiritual consciousness to be able to find those. And then for you, bringing them into the established order for our society, right? Bringing this sense of new spiritual truth into the day-to-day lives of not only yourself, but the collective consciousness. How do we bring more of that back in? Because we've gotten so far away from it, which is an interesting transition because we know that Virgo is all about sacred service to the sacred feminine. Conjunct Venus, the sacred feminine. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. In the 5th house, which is that creative house. But remember, the 5th house is ruled by Leo, the fire sign. So already you're seeing here kind of a transformation, a transition from earth into fire. And so what is it that you're breaking down from the old established order, right? What did we talk about with the sacred masculine and the underworld at the gate of the throat chakra? All the ways in which the divine feminine's voice has been suppressed and silenced. That could be one of the things that you're breaking down in a very creative way. How are you going to be bringing back the truth that the divine feminine's voice has to share in our day-to-day lives? Just one example of what that could look like. And dear Leela is not here today, but the information is here for her. And what's interesting is you and she share that earth element, and your elemental returns are on the same schedule. They will shift when you've shifted into the fire element, but on the earth element, you're on the same schedule. And hers have to do with Taurus and Virgo, and she has that trigon of mastery as you have with the fire. So it's interesting, the similarities between you and Leela. Now,
I just feel like we could learn a lot from each other, right?
Absolutely.
There's so much, like, I just want to learn more from Maureen about, again, what she's developed. And yes, I'd love to learn from, Leela too, about kind of what she's looking at. And, I feel like there's a lot of intersections, right? So, to take the work of an individual and how do you, again, elevate that to the collective in some way, shape, or form.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So just like you are a part of the 20% that are born where Mercury is transitioning from one element to another, there is this group of people. We are not a part of this group. Less than 1% of people will be born on the actual day of an inferior conjunction. So that's pretty groovy to know.
I wonder if that is MLK, right? Like Martin Luther King. Like, I wonder, when I think of that, that's who I think of, right? Like someone of that.
Well,
right? That development. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I will look at his chart and send you a text and let you know. Okay. Okay. So now that we've looked at our personal charts, I just want to let anybody know who may be watching this video at any time in the future. If you would like to know that same information about Mercury in your personal chart, you're free to email me. I must have your full date of birth, and I will send you that information for you. If you've purchased this book and you're having trouble figuring out and just need to have me maybe confirm what you've figured out, because I can tell you that this book can be a little challenging to read from time to time. Feel free to send me what you've worked out and I'll look at it and confirm or tweak it if need be. So anybody now or in the future watching this, feel free to send me an email request and I will just do that for you. Okay, so let's look at the Mercury elemental year. We're in this air elemental year. It runs from February 8th to January 6th next year. As I said, this is my Mercury return year. And where we are right now is we are in the third and final Mercury Synodic Cycle. Oh, and I said the wrong date. I must have been thinking of something else when I said August 23rd. Mercury stationed retrograde, September 27th. Okay, and he's stationed retrograde at 25 degrees of Libra. So that's when this final retrograde phase of the year began. But remember, the retrograde phase is just a minuscule part of the entire 40-day synodic cycle, right? The retrograde period is three weeks. The entire synodic cycle is 40 days. And so in our classes, our Venus classes, we've just been looking at the retrograde period. When is it stationing retrograde? When is it stationing direct? And when does it return to the retrograde point? So we've just barely been scratching the surface in terms of looking at Mercury in terms of its whole synodic cycle. So let's see. Remember the 4 key events in order. The superior conjunction, that's when the sun and Mercury come together. That happened on August 1st at 10 degrees of Leo. Then we have the evening maximum elongation, right? That happens in the western evening sky. That happened this month on September 13th at 19 degrees of Leo. I have the sun is at 20 degrees of Scorpio. So Scorpio is after Libra and the zodiac. And at that maximum elongation, Mercury was at 19 degrees of Libra. Then we know that Mercury stands still, right? He stood still on the 27th. So from the 13th to the 27th, he stood still. He started going retrograde. Oh, I said it was Friday. Pardon me. That inferior conjunction is happening Saturday. So from about Thursday through Monday, pardon me, October 9th is when the inferior conjunction, Mercury and the sun standing in the same place in the sky in the underworld. That will happen at 17 degrees of Libra. And then we'll have the morning maximum elongation. Mercury will be at 14 degrees of Libra on October 25th, and the sun will be at 2 degrees of Scorpio. And so this is an important piece to know about this dance between the sun and Mercury, right? One goes ahead, the other catches up and goes ahead. We will never find the sun and Mercury more than 28 degrees apart. Mercury always dwells in either the same sign or the adjacent sign to the sun. We know that Libra and Scorpio are adjacent to each other. The amount of the maximum elongation varies from cycle to cycle, but the maximum elongation for any particular cycle is never less than 17 degrees and never more than 28 degrees. And so we can see here that this is, you have to remember that there's a 0 degree. So this one is at about 17 degrees. This one is about at the 28 degrees. Okay, so after all we've discussed, can either of you tell me, why do you think that the collective, right, people in general, are obsessed with, when is it Mercury retrograde? Things aren't going well. It must be Mercury retrograde. Why do you think that the collective is obsessed with Mercury retrograde?
Focus on kind of what's going wrong, right? Instead of on a focus on new gifts, new magical enlightenments, or new philosophies. Like, I don't know, I feel like it's a collective focus on what's going wrong versus looking for new, what new enlightenments it can bring, I guess.
That's a very good insight. How about Maureen?
Well, I think they are obsessed with it because, because of what's going to go wrong, as Doreen said. They're worried about signing contracts. They're worried about any big purchases. They're worried about communication breakdown, computer crashes, making travel plans that are going to go terribly wrong and be frustrating. Those are the things that they mostly point out, when we go into a retrograde, instead of the part of it.
Right.
It's the planning ahead that they're worried about. And they will try not to do certain things within a Mercury retrograde.
Right.
Yeah.
But what do we know about Mercury retrograde now? We know that when the Sun and Mercury come together in that inferior conjunction during that middle week of the retrograde phase, that's a magical week. Specifically the 2 or 3 days around that conjunction. So what if you were to sign a contract then? What could happen? Something that you never even thought possible could come of it, right? Because of the magic.
Yeah.
And it's the magical part of Mercury that is innate in all of us, that I think people somehow, subconsciously, unconsciously, they're aware of, but they're not really sure of what to do with it. And so what we see here is the Alchemy of Transformation. And this is a beautiful statement by Gary. Astronomically, at the inferior conjunction, right? That's when the Sun and Mercury come together in the underworld during that retrograde period. Mercury is at the point closest to the Earth for the entire synodic cycle, right? The entire 40 days. This is when Mercury is closest to the Earth, thus accomplishing a linear alignment of the Earth, Mercury, and Sun. And this linear alignment is what they call in alchemy the axis mundi. As Mercury passes between the Earth and Sun spatially, this should say he can be seen to take on a medial role. Medial meaning like a mediating kind of role, serving as a bridge between the limited material experience of Earth and the enormous unlimited potentials of the Sun as a star, the creative energy, the creative engine of our galaxy. Psycho-spiritually, and this is the thing I think that's driving people, psycho-spiritually, they know something's going on, it's not conscious to them, and this is why I think there's this obsession. This represents an opportunity for a similar alignment and mediation right between the tria prima of self. Tria prima is a word that they use in alchemy. We're going to talk about these three selves. We can now bring into harmonious alignment and achieve integration of the three selves, the tria prima, so that both the animal instinctual knowledge of the basic self, that's one of the selves, and the higher wisdom of the spiritual self, that's the second self, can inform the everyday awareness of the talking self, our conscious ego. And in fact, in the glyph of Mercury, what we see is the integration of these three pieces. This crescent shape here is the crescent of the soul. This circle is the circle of spirit. And this cross is the cross of matter. And Gary says the three elements of the glyph symbolize the potential alignment between the three selves. This is the alchemy that happens every time we go through a Mercury Synodic Cycle. And so, we're talking 3 times a year for 40 days. We're going through this alchemical transformation, and specifically during Mercury retrograde, when the Earth and Sun and Mercury are aligned, we have this potential to align and integrate these three selves, the spiritual self, the talking self, and the basic self. So alchemy is built in to this synodic cycle and into the glyph for Mercury. Isn't this amazing?
Yes. I'm just loving this.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So my question is, so every time we go through that 40-day cycle, every time does this have that potential for us to integrate our basic spiritual and talking self, or is it something that is constantly evolving every time we go through a different one? Like, is it creating that potential? And is it, again, for us to kind of grasp that, or is it happening every time and it's just evolving over time?
So that's a really good question. And I would say that something is happening, whether you're consciously engaged with it or not, something is happening. And as I said, I think that this is why, the collective is so obsessed with the Mercury retrograde, because this integration point is happening right smack in the middle of that retrograde phase. And we also know from working consciously with the Venus Synodic Cycle and the Mercury Synodic Cycle that when you start to consciously engage the alchemical process, it's like exponential in terms of the transformation that you're experiencing, right? And remember, each synodic cycle in the triplicity is affecting the others. So what's happened in Aquarius affected what happened in Gemini, and what happened in those is affecting what we're experiencing right now in Libra. So we can dig more into that during the class. So I'm really excited to bring Mercury, to the Rose Wheel Mystery School, and to bring this alchemical piece in as well to the program.
Loving it.
Loving it, yeah.
Processing it. I'm still processing
Yeah.
it all.
Yeah.
I'm loving it.
Yeah. Well, and so let me go back and remind you, buy this book, Maureen and Doreen, today.
And what's the, again, title and author is Gary?
It's Hermetica Triptycha. Here's the title of the book, Hermetica Triptycha, Gary P Caton. You can get it on Amazon. This piece about the alchemy is an entire second section. As I said, we're just kind of dipping our pinky toe in. Everything that I've shared about the actual mechanics of the synodic cycle, that's all in the first part, the first section. So I encourage both of you and anybody that's interested in this class to get this book and start reading it now, because this class starts in January. Great. Maureen, any questions, comments?
Nope, I'm good. Well, I wouldn't say I'm good. I'm, I appreciate all the work you've done. It's good. And there's a lot to dive into.
There's a lot to dive into, especially, you know, we're so used to working with the Venus and Mars cycles, and this is like so far and gone different. It's like a whole paradigm shift for us.
You know, all the planets probably have something as significant to their cycles, you know, and how it's a little bit mind-blowing to try to, I mean, if you were wanting to figure out what all those cycles were and what they meant exactly in your chart. Ooh,
Right.
I know that it affects us whether we are aware of it or not, but it's I just never thought of it that way, that every planet has a cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I just love the alchemy component for this. It's just, yeah.
Yeah,
Amazing.
absolutely. Absolutely. So this is, whoops, sorry. That's my final slide so that anybody watching knows where that they can go to find the Mystery School, and also find us on YouTube. I do have a channel there, and I've got two playlists right now, a Sacred Feminine playlist, a Sacred Masculine playlist. And now with this class, I'm going to add a third playlist for the Cosmic Messenger, which will be there for our classes when we start in January. So you can find me on YouTube as well. So I cannot tell you, both of you, how much I appreciate you showing up for this today and all of your contribution. It's been really fantastic. And it was such a thrill for me to look at your charts and be able to share that personal information with you.
Oh, thank you for that.
Again, thank you. I'm just excited that there's so many layers to this piece and so much to learn and absorb, and again, a whole new way to look at, you know, Mercury retrograde, and just so there's just so much to this. So thank you. Thank you for sharing what you've learned so far, and just a small little piece of, there's so much more to it. So thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And remember, Saturday is that inferior conjunction, Mercury and the Sun together in the underworld, that magical place. So from about Thursday to Monday, however you choose to consciously engage with that, to bring that magic into your life in terms of what it is, you know, that you want to create and manifest, go for it.
Okay.
All right, loves. Thank you so much. I got to stop my share here so that I can. All right, there we go. Now I can end it. Thank you so much. It's so good to see both of you, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.